Welcome everybody to the spring edition of the SASI Lunchbreak on the topic of making due diligence work in practice. My name is Christian Thorn. I'm the director of the Consumer Policy Institute based in Berlin, and I'm delighted to host this rebrushed version of the SASI Lunchbreak today. As you might have read, we have updated the Lunchbreak format a little bit. It was very successful in the last couple of years, but we decided that we take the springtime to also refresh our successful format to make it a little bit less PowerPointy and more dialogue style with a little bit fewer guests and more time for real conversation and for your questions. Secondly, to shift the date from Fridays to Thursdays, because we realized that some of you don't really work on Fridays or not always. So that's why we decided that Thursday might be a better day. And we have decided to make the feel a little bit less MS Teams conference style and hopefully a little bit more podcast news magazine style. So I hope that you will enjoy and appreciate this new format. Why we have made these changes, what they mean for the format and for you, and why we are focusing in our first issue on making due diligence work in practice, let me introduce you to Charlotte Häusler-Bergas. Charlotte is team leader within the Sustainable Agricultural Supply Chain Initiatives. Charlotte, great that you are here together with me. So, Charlotte, one great thing is when I look in the list of participants that have signed up for this event today, I realized that there are actually quite a good number of new participants that might have never had anything to do with the SASI. So what is SASI?
Yeah, thank you, Christian. It's really great to see that so many participants dialed in today, and also great to see so many new participants as well as familiar faces joining us today. Well, what is SASI? In short, SASI works towards the transformation of global agriculture supply chains. So the key topics, the key challenges we're working at are due diligence, living income, deforestation-free supply chains, gender equity, and digitalization. And the SASI is funded by the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. And also through our partner network, we are receiving additional substantial funding from private sector as well as from the EU. SASI is implemented by GIZ, and we're working together with a broad network. That's one of the key characteristics of the SASI. So we're working with a broad network of partners from business, policy, and also civil society. And I'm sure you also want to know what's the goal of all of this.
Yeah, what's the goal of it? Yeah.
So our goal is to work towards fair, green, and inclusive agriculture supply chains that bring improved living conditions for smallholder farmers, and also that bring protection for biodiversity, climate, and the environment.
Okay, so if this is the goal, then there are many activities that you're implementing, and one of the activities is hosting this lunch break format. So what is the function of this lunch break format? Why do we have it?
Well, the lunch break actually has already quite a long history. We started back in 2021, so 5 years ago, under the former initiative ENA. And we initiated the format trying to understand what the German Supply Chain Act was all about and what would it mean in practice. So over the years, the format developed, and now we have a regular platform where companies, policymakers, researchers, and practitioners can exchange practical experiences and insights around due diligence in agricultural supply chains. And now with the rebrush this year, we also want to make this format more dialogue oriented and more focused. So as you already mentioned in your introduction, instead of long presentations, we now want to create a space for conversations around concrete implementation challenges and practical experiences, as well as different perspectives along the supply chain.
So more dialogue, but still the big focus on practical insights for all the practitioners that love this format. So then why have we chosen on making due diligence work in practice as our first topic of this new rebrushed format?
Well, because we really think that the key questions many companies are facing right now are around this topic. We think that there has already been a quite large process in terms of commitments and strategies, but implementation really remains a challenge. So companies are trying to integrate due diligence into everyday business decisions, into procurement processes and corporate culture, and are often facing economic pressure, increasing complexity, etc. At the same time, we also believe that due diligence should not be seen as a compliance exercise or regulatory burden, but it should become part of how companies operate and how they are also able to build resilient and sustainable agricultural supply chains.
Yeah, great. So the key really is implementation is a challenge, and due diligence shouldn't be conceived only as, I don't know, a regulatory compliance issue, but as a business case in itself. So thank you very much, Charlotte, for this introduction, setting the scene. And now, let me further develop a little bit the thinking behind all this. So, as Charlotte has just said, implementation of due diligence in everyday decision processes and corporate culture, this is the key. And making sure that it's aligned with the key business interest. So then the question, if this is the objective, how does one make it to be such a lived thing that due diligence is actually really working in practice? In this context, Professor Dorothée Baumann-Pauly, with whom you will get acquaintance in a few minutes, from the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights, she has developed together with other colleagues 5 success factors, drivers and success factors for transformational business practices. What are these 5 factors? So the first factor is embedding transformation into corporate culture. I think that is quite understandable. Second, conducting meaningful stakeholder engagement. So not only sitting in the own company, but really reaching out to the critical stakeholders in the supply chains. Thirdly, building business capacity and trust with the suppliers. So along the supply chain, you need to build capacity and trust with these core suppliers. Incentivizing accountability, meaning that if suppliers work well, if they not only do what they need to do, but go beyond and take a more responsible approach, then this extra activity should be honored. And fifth, innovating monitoring, which means not only checklist approaches where you tick boxes, but where you really engage in the question of, do we really have an impact? Are we really achieving our goals? Can we do it better? How to make our systems more adaptable, how to increase the impact. So these are the 5 key drivers and success factors that Dorothea Baumann-Pauly has developed together with her colleagues. And the good news is that these success factors are part of a book with the title Transforming Business, Aligning Profits and Human Rights, which will be published later this year. So if these are the success factors, and if we then look into business realities today, we realize that these success factors are only implemented fully by a few companies. Hence, the question is, why are these success factors so important, and what needs to be done so that more companies really lives up to them? So before we start investigating this question, let me ask you 2 questions. And please note that while we obviously can see who responded what, we will treat this absolutely confidential, so nobody else will see the responses of you to these two questions. And the first question is, how far has your organization embedded due diligence into day-to-day business practices? And you can either say, we have fully embedded due diligence across core processes. We have partially embedded it in selected areas. We have embedded it mostly at policy or strategy level, or not yet systematically addressed. That would be great if you could respond to this question. And then there is also a second question that you can respond to, which is, which of these drivers, these success factors, are currently the most difficult ones to implement in practice? And here you can tick a multiple of these. So it would be interesting to learn more which of these drivers are currently the most difficult ones to implement in practice from your perspective. I think I give you, 20 seconds. So we have 10 out of 88. I think that we can improve this. So it would be great if you could respond to these questions. In the first question, you can only tick one of the dots. And in the second question, you can tick more of these boxes. Perfect. Now we have 19. So I give it 10 more seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7. Let us try to reach 30, okay? 5, 4, 3, 30, 2, 1, 29. Come on, one more. That would be great. Difficult. Anyway, so then let us see the results. So what do we learn from the results? So can we please, I don't see the results yet. Why don't I see the results? Okay, unfortunately, I cannot see the results. So maybe somebody can post them to me via Signal or whatever. And I will bring them on board a little bit later. Now I can see them, and I hope that they are also shown to you. So when it comes to the first question, how far has your organization embedded due diligence into day-to-day practices? Most of you, 41, say, we have fully embedded across core processes. A third has said partially embedded in selected areas, with 34%, and 70% mostly at policy strategy level, and 7% have said not yet systematically addressed. So it seems to me that we are quite an experienced group. When it comes to the most difficult ones, the two most difficult ones was stakeholder engagement and incentivizing accountability. Then a little bit less difficult, but still difficult, embedding transformation into corporate culture and business capacity and supplier trust. And the least difficult one was innovating monitoring. Perfect. Thank you very much for your input. And now let us come to the discourse section. Making due diligence work in practice. And I would like to welcome my three distinguished guests for today's events. So first of all, I would like to welcome our guest from the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights. And as you will see, there are already two people in this small box. So great to see you, Professor Dr. Dorothée Baumann-Pauly. She is professor at the University of Geneva School of Economics and Management and the founder and director of the Geneva Center for Businesses and Human Rights. Since 2013, she also serves as the research director at the NYU Stern Center for Business and Human Rights. And in these roles, Doro works with companies and diverse stakeholders to advance human rights in corporate practice. And you might guess, Dr. Berit Knaak is closely working together with Doro. She's a senior research associate at the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights. And in her work, Berit focuses on resilient supply chains and responsible sourcing, studying innovative business models and multi-stakeholder approaches to address structural human rights issues. She has worked on diverse industries and issues, including agriculture, supply chains, sustainable finance, child labor, and fair recruitment of migrant workers. So we have the academic perspective, theory, but obviously we also want to have practice. So we are delighted that Lena Schweighöfer is here with us today. Lena is head of sustainable coffee at Tchibo. In this role, she oversees the Tchibo coffee program, Coffee to Stay, which aims to create long-term prospects for coffee farmers and promote sustainable farming practices. In her previous role, in addition to project work in Kenya and Colombia, her focus was on the implementation of human rights due diligence and the EUDR. So for the next, let's say, half an hour, I would like to focus on 3 topic areas. So the one is, why is it so important to move from strategic commitments to concrete implementation? Second, what works in practice? What can we learn from research and practice for what is working? And thirdly, obviously, it would be great if the audience would also ask their questions. So if you, dear audience, have any questions, please use the chat functionality and I will channel your questions to our 3 distinguished speakers. So let us directly then jump to our first subject areas, from strategic considerations to implementation. Doro, it is always easy to say, and maybe nice to say, that due diligence should be more than a regulatory requirement, but it should also be taken seriously from a business or profit perspective. Also, the subtitle of your forthcoming book suggests that profits and human rights can and should be aligned. Why is this the case? How would you convince a critical CEO who has a lot of pressure that human rights should also be implemented from a profit perspective?
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Christian, for your kind introduction and the fantastic framing referencing our work already. We're here at a business school together, so clearly the question how to implement has been the focus of our work from the inception of the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights. And to stay with the format of this podcast, the short answer to your question is, irrespective of the regulatory environment, human rights issues create material business risks. We all know that there are reputational risks, there are operational risks, there can be operational delays if there's community conflict. It can also be very costly not to act. There are studies that show that the cost of inaction on human rights issues just makes things worse because everything can escalate, and then repairing the lost legitimacy is actually much harder and more costly. So these are sort of the negative business case arguments that I think we're all very familiar with. But at our center, we also focus on what I would call the positive arguments, the positive business case arguments. I can tell you, my students, they want to work for companies that are not in the news for bad things all the time. So if you're interested in attracting talent, doing decent work and decent business is the way to go. Also, we know of many studies that now show working with suppliers works much better if you have a real relationship and you're not just engaging with them in a transactional way. So building these robust supplier relationships creates the resilient supply chains that I think we're all looking for in increasingly volatile times. And taken together, these arguments, I think, create an increasingly robust evidence for engaging in human rights makes good business sense. And if you want the long answer to this, we actually published a report with the Council of Europe last year, Human Rights and Competitiveness, that sort of comprehensively lays out these arguments. So if you have a conversation coming up with your CEO and you need more arguments, more ammunition for that conversation, have a look at this report. That might be helpful. It's a meta study of all the studies out there that prove it makes good business sense to engage in human rights, irrespective of the regulatory requirements. So.
Wow, thank you very much. So irrespective of the regulatory requirements, we have negative and positive business case arguments. The negative business case arguments, the reputational risk, the operational risk, and any cost related to this. And then we have the positive arguments, attracting talent, good relationships with the suppliers. And based on your research, not that there might be CEOs that really want to make the change, but they fail. Why do they fail? So what are the obstacles? What are the hurdles that should be addressed correctly in order not to fail?
So from the survey that we just conducted at the beginning of this event, we seem to have a very advanced audience. So a large majority says that the embeddedness of human rights engagements, policies, procedures is quite advanced. That was the response from the audience. But from our experience, the reason why human rights due diligence still fails frequently is because the embeddedness is actually not very advanced. But instead, human rights due diligence procedures are added to business as usual. So they're an add-on, and it's not understood as it's treated as a silo topic, not as a strategic catalyst for transforming business models. And Berit has a great, very concrete example for this that I think
I just wanted to ask
everyone
about
in the
an example.
audience
That
is
sounds really
engaging in.
abstract.
Okay. That sounds very voila. The concrete
exactly.
example. Yeah.
So one example I could give is that there's often a lack of indicators or metrics how to really measure impact, and many companies rely on audits and surveys. And of course, they have their place and there are standards behind them, and it's regular feedback. But often, as Dorothée just said, it's also a snapshot in time, so they don't cover the full picture. They might overlook issues that belong to the day-to-day life if they are announced, or there are ways to find out when an unannounced audit takes place. So what is needed on top of that is also more reflection on the issues behind it. So and also their own contribution to some of the challenges. So for example, when you test for available of schools in some of the sourcing regions, that doesn't say so much about whether they are fully equipped or whether they have the capacity for the number of children that are in an area. So the reliance on audits is something where we could say that would be a starting point to find better KPIs and ways to measure impact, which probably would also have to change the time frame a bit from one point in time snapshots to more regular interactions. And there are possibilities to do so in day-to-day operations.
Yeah, and across our work, it's clear that these audits are add-ons to sourcing as usual, but what we really need is a reflection on the type of purchasing practices that underpin many of the systemic non-compliances in the supply chain, and auditing won't fix that. Coming back, going through the same auditing checklists over and over again won't eliminate those drivers. If you have falling prices and shortening lead times, this is what creates the pressures in the supply chains, and reflecting on how own sourcing decisions impact human rights is a lot more important than sending an audit team there every 6 months to again record what doesn't work. So
the big mistakes that one should avoid are treating due diligence just as an add-on, a silo approach, over-reliance on audits, but then in the positive sense. So how should one do it correct? What does embedding mean in a nutshell?
Yeah, I can be very brief because you did such a great job introducing sort of the essence of our forthcoming publication. The topic of this podcast excites me so much because this is what we work on. What works in practice? Human rights due diligence, is a concept that was developed by late Harvard professor John Ruggie. And we have, I think, over the past 15 years, tried to understand top down, what does human rights due diligence do, how does it work in practice? And I want to flip this. I want to look at companies that have already engaged in business practices that have a proven positive impact for workers and communities. I want to understand how do they do this? And then how can we distill the lessons from these cases to inspire and support others to scale and replicate these approaches? So we have a bottom-up approach to understanding what good human rights due diligence looks like in practice and what works in practice. And through this case-based approach and intense field research, we have distilled the 5 drivers which you presented at the beginning, and I'm sure we'll come back to them in the conversation with Lena.
Great, and that brings us to Lena.
Yeah.
Lena, so when we look at Tchibo, then Tchibo is considered to be a company that is really putting due diligence into practice. So, but why is this the case? So if we were to ask your CEO, why are you doing it? What would be the response?
Yeah, first of all, hi everyone, and thanks for the invitation. I'm quite excited to participate in this first new session of the new format of the SASI Lunchbreak, and I'm also looking forward to the exchange with the theory part with the researchers. But to answer your question directly, for Tchibo, taking up responsibility is a given. It's part of our company values, and it's also anchored in our DNA as a family-run business. And our human rights and environmental due diligence process is based on international standards, and it's part of this responsibility. And it has been integrated for our coffee and non-food supply chains for quite some time. Actually, our CR department was established between 2006 and 2008. And since then, we have been working in identifying and addressing risks in a more systemic way. But apart from these company values and our responsibility, implementing human rights and environmental due diligence is strategic as it makes us more resilient as a company. And Dorothée also mentioned the operational risks, for example, but also like really concrete long-term partnerships and collaboration with suppliers in addressing human rights and environmental risk can also strengthen the business relationship overall. And especially for coffee, the business case is really clear. If we still want to source green coffee from different origins in about 50 years' time, we need to address challenges like climate change, and we need to support smallholder farmers to improve their living conditions and make or support making coffee a viable business for them.
Lena, was there actually, I don't know, a turning point, a shock moment? So if I think about the textile industry, Rana Plaza, obviously where it was a wake-up call for the industry. You mentioned now 2006 to 2008, that this was the turning point where your company really decided we need to tackle this issue strategically. I don't know, was there a scandal? Was there a moment that really brought it to this point?
Well, I mentioned that we started around 20 years ago with building up our human rights and environmental due diligence processes. And indeed, it was also in response of some NGO campaigns back in those days. And then we started to building a strategy, an approach, and a program based on international standards, and with the ambition to create real impact. And we continuously kept the processes up to date to the emerging due diligence frameworks. And it evolved parallel, I would say. So there was not really, of course, it all started with those campaigns. And you mentioned Rana Plaza. I feel it gave a push to the whole textiles industry, of course. But for us, there was not really like the one turning point. But to give you one more recent example, when the German Supply Chain Act entered into force, it helped us to somehow further professionalize or formalize our processes and to take further business units into account, such as internal buying or human resources. And now, even for those departments, those due diligence processes became a day-to-day practice, as it has been for non-food and coffee for a longer time.
And Lena, maybe nobody else was listening, which is not the case. But anyway, were there department sections that said, oh God, what they want to do, that's just a nightmare, we don't want this? So were there frictions within Tchibo?
Yeah, sure. So there we face resistance, especially when people get the impression that human rights and environmental due diligence is just a bureaucratic process without real impact or without any benefit for the company. And to be honest, not only in other departments, but also within our sustainability people, we sometimes feel a little bit overwhelmed by external demands, reporting requirements, documentation requirements. Why? Because we want to focus on the impact work. But what we can say is that even departments which were a little bit more resistant maybe to it in the first place came to appreciate those due diligence approaches. If not for the reason of sustainability, then because of supply chain risk management. And I think we heard that already also from Dorothée.
We are now moving on to my second topic areas, and that was, okay, we discussed now why it's on a general level important to move from strategic considerations to implementation. Now the real question is how to do it right. So Lena, what would you say? Because on the one hand, we have quite experienced participants, 40+% said that they have already fully embedded it, but there are also some that are still a little bit on their way. So what are recommendations? How to do it right? What are your lessons, Lena, from Tchibo? What has made the biggest difference in embedding due diligence in a right and pragmatic way?
So for me, the most important aspect is the inclusion of rights holders and local stakeholders. And while like more comprehensive guidelines on what this multi-stakeholder engagement means have been developed recently, we follow this principle in our program design for quite some time. And that means we engage with stakeholders like supply chain partners and design the programs together with farmers and co-ops in the coffee supply chain, but also with workers and their representatives, including unions in the non-food section. And it is so crucial because there is no one-size-fits-all approach, and local conditions are different. They must be taken into account. The needs of rights holders are different, and we need to include them to then develop measures that really matters and have an impact also in long term. And for coffee, this means, for example, that we are not we do not rely on certification, but we work with tailor-made projects within our global Coffee to Stay program. That means we use data from our supply chains about risks and opportunities really as a basis, but then work really closely with our traders and exporters, with the co-ops, with the farmers, to go deeper and understand those risks and especially the root causes behind it, and then develop activities together to address those risks and root causes, and ultimately to improve the livelihoods of coffee producers. And well, sorry if it's a little bit repetitive, but really by including them from the very beginning, we ensure that what we are doing is also serving their needs and that we also create ownership. And we also monitor continuously the satisfaction of project beneficiaries, and we adopt it if necessary. And
Dorothée, so if you listen to these kind of key factors, so I took, inclusion of rights holders, close collaboration with the supply chain actors. There is no one-size-fits-all thing. One needs to find the correct solution for a particular challenge, and good monitoring. Are these kind of transferable success factors that we can all embrace or should all embrace?
Yeah, absolutely. I was really happy to listen to you, Lena, because indeed they correspond quite closely to the drivers we identified through case studies in other areas. And foundational, I believe, is first a principled commitment, which you mentioned in the first half of your response. And then you also highlighted the need for longer term sourcing relationships. If you switch suppliers, or in this case, cultivators and farms all the time, I mean, you cannot build up the capacity and the trust and establish the standards that you would like to see implemented in the field. So clearly longer term sourcing relationships are, I think, a really strong indicator for a company's robustness of a human rights commitment. The short-term business relationships undermine all the good intentions that may be on paper. So that again goes towards the purchasing practices, and long-term sourcing relationships are foundational, and that is true across the industries that we have analyzed. And there are many other elements, no size fits all, and the need to engage with local actors. It's most important to truly understand what works in a given specific context. We have just come back from field research in the Ivory Coast, where we've seen that the solutions that make sense in principle need to be adapted by, for example, talking to female farmers that disagree that these solutions are just good news for them personally. So understanding these different perspectives on the ground and working with local communities to, as you said, also transfer ownership for carrying those solutions forward. These are all elements that we've seen working very well across the good case studies that we analyzed. Yeah.
That sounds all good, but are there actually also false friends, i.e. meaning solutions and recommendations that sound really good and totally compelling, but in the end don't deliver in practice?
Yeah, so we want to talk about two, and examples. Over to Berit again.
Yeah. So actually, the first element is related to the commitment and policy part. So as a first step, when institutionalizing that framework, we often see zero tolerance policies, saying that we don't accept any form of child labor or forced labor in our supply chains. So the consequence would be that if you detect a case that some say, okay, we quit, we terminate this relationship with our supplier. And this is one example that we would call a false friend, because zero tolerance policies can be problematic if they lead to termination rather than engagement. So the point is that for one, it sets an incentive to hide issues rather than bring them up and discuss them, because maybe there's a solution that can be found together. And secondly, very concretely for the affected people, this can lead to pushing the problem into deeper layers of the supply chain and making things even worse. So for example, if children are eliminated from farms where they do light work, they might end up in mining, which is even more detrimental to their health. And the second one that is maybe a little bit less obvious would be the observation that some practices or solutions that look good in practice might have side effects and unintended consequences that make the result less good than you would hope for. So one example that we've just recently seen in Côte d'Ivoire again is that we've visited farming communities, and a solution to, well, their dire economic situation is often diversify their income. So the suggestion is that they can invest in other food crops or in other commercial crops. And the problem is, who does that work? The number of household members doesn't increase. So often it's the women who, on top of working on the fields for one thing, taking care of the children, taking care of the household, are then also expected to spend time in the fields. So this is a solution that doesn't work if you don't understand the unintended consequences. And that's just one recommendation or principle to test the solutions, whether they work in practice. That might be a false friend here.
So tests your solution, and that blends now very nicely to the questions of the audience. And I think that there is one question that directly relates to these unintended consequences. So the question is, I've seen many companies change suppliers, even avoid entire countries to avoid systemic risks. This reduces the leverage that we have to actually change the situation on the ground. Do you think that if a company joins a collective action to address systemic or endemic risk, this could be considered a risk mitigation action that would hold up in court as proof of compliance with due diligence regulations?
No, I hope not. No, it's really not in the spirit of maybe using the same example again. If you have a zero tolerance policy for child labor and you then just kick out the children or you leave the supplier once you detect child labor, I mean, this is not in the spirit of human rights due diligence and the idea that we want to work with actual business partners. Instead, clearly, the policy should be, we envisage a world where children don't work and we remediate every case we identify. To me, this would be a more useful policy, the commitment to fully remediate every case, understanding that the business realities on the ground make it very unlikely that you never identify a case if you work in agriculture. It's the industry where child labor is most common across all industries, and particularly in West Africa, for example. So the zero tolerance policies, they do not acknowledge the realities on the ground. And I think we need a much greater degree of honesty of dealing with the business complexities. Same thing for avoiding specific suppliers or entire countries. If you're already invested in a country, cut and run is really not the approach that we would like to see. And that's
Lena,
also something that courts should acknowledge.
Lena, cut and run should not be the strategy.
Yeah, I fully agree on that. I still would like to add, and this is like more relevant maybe for the non-food section. There are also duties for governments, and there are countries with state-enforced or state-induced forced labor, and in those cases, I feel that companies, a single company is limited in what they can do. And I think that's part of the truth, like the responsibility that companies have, but also the responsibility the governments play in this whole setting.
Lena, there's one question to you, because you made this very strong case that you said, companies should develop close relationships with the producers within the supply chains. How does Tchibo develops these kind of close relationships? Because you need to invest time and resources into this in times where many companies cut jobs or where more and more is put on the plate of employees. So how does one invest in these kind of relationships, and how does Tchibo do it?
Yeah, so we do it because we believe that it is right. And I made this business case for coffee. And it's, in fact, it's not just sustainability work, but it's also the future of our business. And it's true. It needs some investments, financial investments, but also personal investments to build those relationships. But if we really want to create impact, we need to do it. And it's not and we had that conversation before. It's not a tick the box exercise. And we also try to, when we implemented the German Supply Chain Act, to distinguish a little bit, okay, what is a tick the box exercise? It's a regulation, we have to do it. And what are the fields where we really see, if we do it right, we can have impact? And this, in our coffee program, this really being close to those people producing the coffee is crucial, and we do it because we really believe that's right.
Doro, let's assume I'm a very successful CEO. I have a company with 10,000 employees. I'm listening into this great lunch talk format. I listen to Lena, to Berit, and you. And in the way, on my heart, I'm fully convinced, I, as a CEO, I should implement this. but I'm under such severe pressure, supply chains, unpredictabilities, my competition, they don't care. And now you're telling me that I should invest in all these activities, close relationship with my suppliers. I don't fully know who they are. I know it's all complicated with these small holders. Where should I start? And how can I organize it in an efficient way?
Yeah, I love the little scenario you're outlining here. This is how I start my courses at the University of Geneva. So the business students are overwhelmed and they're in shock and horror over sort of the task that I'm giving them. And by the end of the semester, they know how to slice and dice and very rationally look at, huge societal challenges, understanding their own role in it. I think it's great that Lena highlighted there are trade-offs, and we have to be honest about engaging in human rights is not cost-free. Often investments are necessary, investments that ensure long-term business success. Lena referenced the resilience of the supply chain. There might not be coffee supply unless those farmers want to continue cultivating coffee, unless they have livelihoods that sustain coffee farming. And that requires a long-term business perspective, and ideally the CEO, looking at the complexity, has a little bit of support from by a regulatory framework that instills a vision for an economy that works for all, an economy that leaves no one behind. And in our work, we develop solutions for these complexities. So we would also like to instill optimism that it can be done by case studies that show these are companies that are successful and they're advancing human rights. So that's what we hope to highlight. There can be alignment without overselling the business case, without propagating the business case without nuance, because the simplistic win-win doesn't work. There are costs involved, investments are necessary, but eventually there will be more robust and resilient businesses.
Perfect. Then we have the first question is directed to Doro, and the question is, to what extent do you see changes to business purposes, for example, with regard to inclusion of a social purpose mission, the legal form, benefit corporation, flexible purpose corporation, common interest companies, or ownership models, employee ownership, foundation ownership, cooperatives, as possible drivers to support embedding human rights protection in the company?
A great question, very smart question. I do believe it matters. If purpose is fully embedded in the DNA of how a company defines itself, that's helpful. It shapes how leadership leads. It shapes how decision-making processes are done with a compass, a moral compass, or without. So it does help. The ownership structure helps as well. If you have shareholders, it's harder to transform. If privately held companies have founders and owners that are convinced, they can make decisions quickly and they can transform quicker. But
Lena, would you agree that you mentioned Tchibo is a family-run business? Would it make a difference if it wasn't a family-run but a shareholder business? It's difficult to say, but what's your feeling?
Yeah, well, I think it is one factor. If it's a shareholder run, there are other maybe bigger reporting requirements. There are interests of investors. It's really not my field of expertise, but I think it's, as I said, it's one of the factors that that leads to the fact that we take the sustainability and responsibility seriously.
There cannot be an event without the AI question. So because we've been talking about all the difficulties and that we need to invest in relationships and so on, but can AI play a role in due diligence and make our lives easier? Doro.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm quite excited about the opportunities with AI and also terrified about the risks. So in terms of the opportunities, I do think if you have huge complex supply chains, there are now ways to map it better, to trace and track and monitor it better. But, never has technology been the silver bullet on complex social issues. So you still need human oversight. I mean, there might be smart indicators now that can flag places, or let's say factories or fields, where the company should take a closer look at, because some factors indicate, for example, many migrant workers, political changes, falling prices. So if things come together in a toxic mix, AI can flag, hang on, this is something we need to make sure that our workers are safe. But then someone still needs to go and check and remediate. So on the remediation part, that's most important to me. I don't think AI is super helpful. But flagging, yes. Getting your arms around big data and all that, very helpful. But the
Lena, would you
real
agree?
work is still very human, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah, so I was immediately thinking I don't really want to talk about it again, but I think for the European Deforestation Regulation, I was thinking immediately about it because AI can, of course, support in monitoring deforestation, for example. I think it works quite well for some of the environmental topics, and it will also help to make reporting and documentation easier. It will help to put data together in a way we can more easily digest it, etc. But I also agree on what Dorothée said. If it's about working with people, we still need to be on the ground, and AI won't solve anything, and it won't do the mitigation work for us.
Perfect. Thank you very much for all these insightful ideas. And now I have the most cruel part of this whole kind of podcast. And this is 2 questions in 20 seconds or something like this. Dora or Berit, which arguments or statements in this context are you fed up with hearing?
Okay, I'll take one. So the most common way to describe continuous improvement on human rights due diligence has become this metaphor of the journey. And I'm under the impression there are companies that are on a forever journey, sometimes a forever journey towards nowhere. And I would like to instill more rigor in our and greater ambition in our implementation journey. I would like to know, what do we expect? What are the standards? What do we want to achieve? And are the measures we're employing actually achieving what we would like to see? So can we please measure the impacts and be honest about which measures work, which don't work so well? So the journey alone is not good enough.
So less journey talk, more concrete facts on the ground.
Thank you.
Lena, for Tchibo, if you could start again, what would you do or what would you approach differently?
Okay, well, not really surprising, and I will keep it very short. Incorporating the perspective and needs of rights holders from the very beginning, instead of pushing certain values and standards into the supply chain. Great.
And then this is another circle for the CEO. What are the 20 seconds that she needs to hear in order to be compelled that embedding due diligence is really important? So what are the 2-3 arguments that the CEO should hear from you or from all the audience in order to convince them? Lena?
Well, I think the point is to show that human rights and environmental due diligence makes a company more resilient. It's about establishing more reliable partnerships and better manage general supply chain risks.
Perfect. Dora or Berit?
We're still discussing. So I would say, indeed, it's good business, good for business and for society, and human rights due diligence can be a catalyst for business model transformation that have societal positive impacts and positive impacts for business.
Wow, what a great event today. Thank you so much. I think we learned so much why embedding it in practice, due diligence, is so important. We have heard about the good arguments, why to do it and how to do it, what not to do, and how to do it in an efficient way. So a big applause to you. Normally, if we would have flowers, it would now be the time to pass on flowers, which is difficult now in this virtual world. So thank you very much on behalf of all the participants. So that brings us to the final stage of this, kind of a small outlook or newsflash. And for this newsflash, I would like to ask Charlotte again to join me here on stage. So, Charlotte, when we talk about the sphere of sustainability in agricultural supply chains, are there some upcoming events, conferences, fora that participants, the audience, should be aware of to register for what is going on out there?
Yeah, of course there are. But first of all, I want to thank our speakers today and also everyone who participated from the audience for this very interesting discussion. It was really great to listen to it. So thank you. Well, you asked about the events. I'd like to mention one event that happened yesterday in Bonn. That was the kickoff meeting of the SASI Learning and Scaling Labs, and both of us had the chance to participate. With these learning and scaling labs, we, the SASI, want to bring together stakeholders across agricultural supply chains to discuss promising approaches and pilot projects that can be scaled for broader impact. So I really like the event, and I really like to see all these promising pilots that are out there. And I also like the inspiring discussions that those pilots brought up. So if you're interested in participating in these learning and scaling labs, you can get in touch with us through our usual communication means, website, LinkedIn, and email. There's another SASI initiative I'd like to mention, and that's the Diaska Dialogues. This is a new monthly exchange format focusing on digital public infrastructure, traceability, and geodata, topics that are increasingly relevant for due diligence implementation and UDR readiness. So you can register to these Diaska dialogues through our Diaska website. We also see a couple of important events coming up organized by other parties around the topic of living income and living wages. I'd like to mention 3 events here. The first is the Coffee Barometer on 11th of June. That will be launched in a webinar that's organized by Conservation International, Ethos Agriculture, Solidaridad Network, and Vocal. The second event later in June is the World of Coffee Europe in Brussels that will bring together coffee sector stakeholders. And the third event on 30th of June is the IDH's Living Wage and Living Income Summit in Rotterdam. So 3 important events in the topic of living income and living wage. And lastly, coming back to today's topic of due diligence, I'd also like to draw your attention to the 5th call for proposals of the Due Diligence Fund that is currently still open until June 15th. The Due Diligence Fund is an instrument to support innovative partnerships and approaches to strengthening due diligence in global agricultural supply chains. And you can find more information on this on our website. Thank you so much for joining today, and over to you, Christian.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, for this overview of what's going on. And I think there are many activities, as we see, that are going on. And there was a question on where to find more information. So on Diaska, on the Due Diligence Fund, on the SASI Learning and Scaling Labs, you can find more information on the SASI website. For the other events from other organizations, obviously you need to Google these organizations and then sign up if you're interested. So that was an experiment. It was the rebrushed version of the SASI Lunchbreak. To be honest, I learned so much. I learned so much about good arguments, why due diligence should be incorporated into practices. I learned how to do it correctly, what mistakes to avoid, and I sensed a great energy and spirit with those who are engaging this. So thank you very much for your attention, for your participation. If you have any feedbacks or comments that you liked or disliked, how we set it up now, please write an email to sasi@giz.de, to sasi@giz.de, and give us your feedback. And otherwise, see you again in 2 months' time on the 2nd of July, again on a Thursday from 1 to 2 with a great new lunch break event. So thank you very much and see you hopefully in 2 months' time. Bye-bye.